Okay, good afternoon, everybody, or good afternoon if you're following us from Switzerland. My name is Awasar. I am Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center at Michigan State University. And this is Eye on Africa, our weekly seminary series. I'm very happy today to have with us Mr. Christopher Mbanefo. He's going to talk to us about powered blockchain. And I have also with me Dr. Philip Afiong, who's gonna introduce our guest for today. Philip, you have it.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're signing in from. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Christopher Mbanefo, our speaker for today's Eye on Africa program. Originally from Onitsha in Nigeria, Christopher Mbanefo is founder and CEO of the aviation design firm YASAVA Solutions, as well as the founder and CEO of OXI-ZEN Solutions, which is currently developing blockchain-powered solutions for unique peer-to-peer carbon dioxide transactions using the latest scientific tools, satellite data, and artificial intelligence. The net result is the creation of new transparent, sustainable ecosystems and financial models that empower disenfranchised members of society. As an innovator and entrepreneur, Mr. Mbanefo combines more than 30 years in multidisciplinary activities. He is an aerospace engineer and professional pilot, having worked with various world-class original equipment manufacturers and airlines in leading-edge programs in Europe, the United States, and Africa, in aviation, IT, telecom, and renewable energy. Mr. Mbanefo also consults with different organizations and government bodies in areas of applied science, sustainability, ethics, and climate change. He is a full member of the Club of Rome and is engaged in advancing 21st century solutions for the global common good. Mr. Mbanefo will be speaking on the topic, Shifting the Paradigm, Oxi-zen, a blockchain-powered program by Africans to achieve planetary carbon dioxide balance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was a very nice introduction. I appreciate that. And I also welcome all the guests here as well. And I'm coming to you from Switzerland, from Montreux, Switzerland. So behind me, you can see images of the Jazz Festival. So that's one of the nice things about Montreux. And I think without too much ado, I'll just head into the discussion, after which I welcome questions. And the basic idea is to have an exchange, a dialogue. So, and to keep it a little bit interesting, I do have to say that the topic may be a bit overwhelming for certain people, in the sense of when you hear blockchain and you hear science and you hear this and that. So don't be overwhelmed. We'll go step by step. I hope not to lose anybody, and I'll keep it as interesting as we can, possibly do. But it is an interesting topic. It's actually really, really something very cool, which I'm very happy to share with all of you. So I'm going to share my screen, and we'll take it up from there. I need authority from the host, please, that I can share the screen. Okay, thank you very much. So what are we talking about today? We're talking about shifting the paradigm. I call this chapter 2 because I gave a TEDx talk a couple of years back, which I call chapter 1. There has been progress from chapter 1 to chapter 2. And effectively, we need to understand where we are today. We are where we are with all the challenges that we have as a species, as a global community, as a result of partly successes that we have had within our spheres of life, but we also have a lot of problems that not only our current generation are being faced with, but we also have problems with that our children and our children's children will be faced with. And so we basically can say that the 19th and 20th century economic models that we have been using need to be changed. Because otherwise, we've arrived at a precipice, and if we continue, we will go over the edge. And so the challenge for all of us is to come up with ways of potential solutions that will assist us to have a world that we can hand over to our grandchildren and experience that with them. So let's take a look at a couple of issues here. The aim of today's talk is to really recognize that natural capital, what is called natural capital, has real value. And it's not value based on emotional terms. We want to hug trees and things like that. No, but based on scientific facts. And if that is so, can we relate it to some form of an economic metric? And if yes, then that basically raises the question of how GDP is actually being measured, which is a big question mark. Is that the right metric that we're currently using to measure the output of an economy? And not just the output of an economy, but the net value this economy is actually adding to the common good. So we can have a talk about that. And if we are successful in that, we inevitably arrive at a new paradigm. That is a new way forward. And so what I'm going to talk about today is one way, a possible way that seems to make sense. And it is a part of the solution. I'm not here to say this is the entire solution. No way. This is just a small contribution to the jigsaw puzzle of a new picture, a new image of the future that our children and our grandchildren will be able to also enjoy. So, what is the challenge? The challenge is effectively that we have a planetary imbalance. Our planet is out of balance. That's one. Two, our planet is our spaceship. I don't know whether you guys saw, some of you saw this Netflix series that just came out, Inspiration 4, about the first civilian space mission into space, which was done by SpaceX. Elon Musk, an African, if I may add, born on the continent of Africa. So the fact is that our Earth, our planet, is a spaceship with everything that effectively goes on with it. That's all we have. And we cannot ignore something that is happening seemingly on the other side of the planet, because it affects us. If we remember the Titanic, the party was going on the deck, They hit an iceberg. There was a hole, there was a leak. The third-class passengers were feeling it. They were running upstairs because the water was filling up. So the third-class passengers were coming into the space of the second-class passengers. The second-class passengers were now moving up to the first-class passengers that were still enjoying a jolly good time, totally not aware that the ship was sinking. I like to use that image because that is precisely what is going on in the planet right now. We have hit an iceberg, literally speaking. The passengers, this global citizens, third-class citizens, are running into the second-class space. And the second-class citizens are running into the so-called first world. That's another paradigm or another way of explaining the refugee problem that we have in the world today, which is caused by a number of things, including climate change. So what's happening in the south of the border between the US and Mexico is an analogy of what happened on the Titanic before everybody sank. So, le trou est de leur côté. Ah, quelle chance pour nous. The hole is on their side. How lucky for us. The foolishness of that statement is precisely equivalent to the foolishness of not recognizing that we're all on the same planet. We're all in it together. We've got to sort it out together. So let's take a look at some of the numbers here. When we talk about the CO2 emissions and carbon sequestration meaning the absorption, the capturing of carbon. So when we look at what's being captured or what is sequestered by terrestrial carbon sinks, you have the details there. I won't go too much into the details, but what you see on the image on the right-hand side, in other words, where we've got the image of the planet, effectively you can see what is green, and that is a snapshot of where CO2 is sequestered out of the atmosphere and is stored in the soil through the process of photosynthesis by vegetation, plants, trees, etc. Now let's look at some numbers. Based on the planet, we arrive at 69–70% is happening in the tropical regions of the planet, and about 30% is happening in the temperate regions of the world, of the planet. So we can see that the majority of the carbon sequestration is happening in the tropical regions of the planet. So if we take that into account and we say, all right, what does that mean? Well, it's interesting, because if that is the case, and we look at something called the global carbon market. So you've all heard of carbon certificates and carbon trading and this and that, and companies are basically, offsetting their carbon footprint. There's a market going on of over $250 billion. So if 70% of the actual carbon sequestration is happening in the tropical regions, you would reasonably expect about 70% of the 250 billion would be flowing into the tropical regions. That's a logical conclusion, which I share. But let's look at the facts. The fact is less than 1.5% goes there. So that's one of the issues. The other issue is that there are huge investments that are basically ongoing. The green revolution, electrification of the auto industry, the electrification of the aviation industry. There's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of money being pushed into these technologies, which is right. But the fact that 1.5% of the global carbon trade capital is going into where 70% of the carbon is actually taken out of the atmosphere, that means that there is no financial investment for terrestrial carbon sequestration, which means it has no economic value. They have no economic value. So if anybody wants to know why is the Amazon burning, why are the forests in Borneo, Southeast Asia, in the Congo Basin, why are they burning? Because for most people, they have no economic value. That's a challenge. So if we go into some of the more details of the main causes for what we call the planetary imbalance, which I'll talk about a little bit more afterwards, without going too much into details, this has been studied and it's all part of the IPCC report. So those of you who are interested in that, there's a lot of literature out there, scientific literature as well. But the bottom line at the end of the day is that we have a lot of emissions. So the arrows that are going up are the emissions of CO2, and the arrows that are coming down, that constitutes the absorption. So there's more going up than is coming down. That causes a problem. And it's also interesting to see, just as a, so that we kind of get an understanding of what's happening, so to speak. We hear about carbon emissions of aeroplanes, aviation, the cars, this and that. But it's interesting that over 1/4 of the emissions that are happening is actually caused due to the production of food. And if we want to break this down even more, that's where you can see it. So land usage, crop production, livestock, fisheries, supply chain. And the interesting thing is that the supply chain, of which transportation is 6%, is actually a smaller part of what's actually going on here. And so this gives us food for thought. But the long and short of it is the following. When we look at the greenhouse gas emissions in 2018, and this is taken from the IPCC reports, we have about 50 gigatons, 48.9, that were emitted. If we look at the net emission sinks, that's the net sequestration that occurred, you arrive at all the forests, all the vegetations on the planet absorb 30%, 31%. A little bit more goes into the ocean, 35%. And the larger part remains stuck in the atmosphere, continues to accumulate in the atmosphere. That's our 36% here. And that increased accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere is actually the cause of climate change. And the other thing, the absorption of CO2, the abnormal high absorption of CO2 into the oceans, is causing a reduction in the pH factor or an increased acidification. And that acidification, that increased acidification is the root cause at the end of the day of coral bleaching and the creation of dead zones within our ocean. Now, I can tell you a little bit more about why we should be alarmed. But I won't go into that now. But we need to be alarmed. We need to be alarmed. So if we take these numbers and we say, okay, what does it mean? So it means, as we said, 36% remains in the atmosphere, 35% is absorbed by the oceans, and the smaller amount is actually absorbed by the terrestrial carbon sinks. So this is an imbalance. Now, the interesting thing is that if we have arrived at this millennial goals of a reduction of CO2 emissions between now and 2050 of 50%. And everyone is working on that. The politicians are pushing that. Everybody's talking about CO2 emission reduction, CO2 emission reduction. Yes, but let's ask a question. If we actually accomplish that, what do we actually gain? Question mark. So let's assume we are able to get this down to 50%, all else remaining equal. You still only have 30%, 31% absorbed by terrestrial carbon sinks, and so about 20 going into the oceans. Now, at this point, I guess I do have to explain why this amount of CO2 going into the oceans is not exactly to our benefit. So let me take a time out. I just mentioned before that that's the root cause of coral bleaching. What are the corals? What do the corals represent in the ocean? If we were to remove all the water from the ocean, what would we see? What we would see is effectively a desert landscape. A desert landscape with coral reefs in different parts of the planet. Now, when you have a desert, in a desert, if you have life in a desert, it means that you have oases, you have sources of water in different parts of the desert. And the oasis is the source of life, is the beginning of life. That's where life starts. That's the chain of life starts in the oasis. The coral reefs play exactly the same role within the ocean. That's where life starts. So that's the beginning of the food chain. That's the beginning of the life chain, is in the coral reef. So if the coral reefs die, that's the equivalent of poisoning the water source, the oasis, or it's drying out. And once that is gone, there's no more life in the desert. Once the oasis, once the coral reefs are gone, you can basically conclude it's only a question of time and there'll be no more life in the ocean. Here's another interesting point. Today, because of the acidification of the oceans, we are measuring an effect on a species called the crustaceans. Those are shrimps, lobsters, everything that we all like to eat. Now, what is quite interesting about that particular species is that it scales down 1-to-1 right down to the plankton level. So if you look at the plankton level under the microscope, you look at the plankton level, you can see the crustaceans, literally one-to-one, shrimps, lobsters, etc., the same life form, scaled down, very interesting life form. So what this means is that every time a whale opens its mouth and takes a gulp of seawater, we say, or we are told, oh, they nourish themselves with plankton. It's not quite true. The whales are actually, with every mouthful, they are surf and turfing. So they're taking plankton and they're taking the crustaceans in, which is actually their prime source of protein. But unfortunately today, we are measuring that these life forms, the crustaceans, they are losing more shell material today than they are able to produce. That is, the acidity of the ocean has reached a point where they are literally dissolving in front of our eyes. So if we fast forward, everything continues, the way it is going, in the next 5 or 10 years, it will be difficult to get wild shrimps, wild lobster, oysters, and everything else associated. Every life form that has a shell produced primarily out of calcium will be affected. And I am predicting that in the next couple of years, we will start to see a phenomenon of whales starving in the ocean. And people will be saying, oh my God, what's going on? What's happening? Why are the whales starving? What's happening? Isn't there enough plankton? Yeah, there is enough plankton, but the problem is that due to the acidity, the crustaceans are gone. At that point, the wake-up call is it's no longer a wake-up call. You hit the alarm on snooze, and you wake up and you find, oh, geez, I'm 30 minutes late. I guess it's happened to all of us, right? So when the whales start starving, that's no longer a wake-up call. That's snooze effect. So this is why, coming back to this graph here, if we reduce emissions by 50%, all else being equal, we still only have 30% absorbed. We still have 20% going into the ocean. We haven't solved the issue. We have not solved the problem. So food for thought. So what we need is, in order to get from 30 to 50%, to stop, effectively have the terrestrial carbon sinks, do 90, 100% of the absorption of the CO2, we need to increase the terrestrial carbon sinks by 60%. So whatever you see, all the forests and everything that you see, we have an obligation that, in the assumption that we can reduce emissions by 50%, we have to also increase the carbon sequestration capacity by 60% to achieve a planetary balance. That's the challenge. And so, looking at a pivot, we got to shift that pivot point from an imbalance. We need to balance it. So the talk today is the equivalent of the talk today is somebody left the bathtub on. The bathtub is overflowing. Someone left the tap on, right? And all the wise people on the planet get together and say, we have it. Between now and 2050, we've got to reduce the tap by 50%. Is that going to work? No, it's not going to work. Every kid knows that. And yes, that rubber duck will eventually fall over the edge. That rubber duck is us, is you, me, all of us here. So the only way to prevent that rubber duck from going over is what? As somebody is reducing the tap, yes, we got to reduce emissions. Somebody has to open the drain, unplug the bath. And once the outflow equals the inflow, guess what? The overflow stops. So that's just another example of the picture, the image. So when we look at the situation, and don't be overwhelmed with all this written stuff and numbers, I'll basically boil it down. If we have the total greenhouse gas emissions of 2018 of close to 50,000 gigatons, we can say that the terrestrial carbon sequestration, which is about 30%, would equal to 15.2 gigatons, or about slightly over 4 gigatons of carbon a year. If we look at the current price that companies are prepared to pay for in Europe to have 1 metric ton of carbon sequestered at a price of 51 euros a ton, you arrive at 215 billion euros a year. Call it about 220, 225 billion US dollars a year is what is actually happening. Now, but that's only accounted for 1/3, right? That's only 31%. It means that us not sequestering the carbon that goes into the ocean and into the atmosphere is a debt, can be looked at as an economic debt of close to $700 billion a year. That's another way of saying, whatever we don't take care now, and we pass it on to our children and to our grandchildren, that's the equivalent economic debt that they have to pay for in economic terms. So what this also means, why is this called an opportunity, is because the actual sequestration has an economic value. So let's look at it in a different way. When we look at the greenhouse gas emissions of the G20 countries from 1990, actually this should be 1998, sorry. No, it's 1990, sorry, that is correct. From 1990 to 2018, we arrive at a figure of 914 gigatons of CO2. That includes the weight of the O2. So the molecular weight of the O2 has to be deducted to arrive at what the carbon is. So you arrive at 211 gigatons of carbon as a carbon. And applying that price of 51 euros, that equates to close to 13 trillion euros. Now, 13 trillion euros, how does that equate to? I believe the US government just increased the money supply by about $4 trillion in the last 18 months or so. So that's more than 3 times that which has been emitted, of which 31% has been absorbed by the stakeholders, the owners the areas and regions of the global terrestrial carbon sinks. And so if we now say, all right, how much is that? Well, 31% of 12.9 is 4.3. So that is more than what has been added to the US economy, is what has been sequestered by those who have terrestrial carbon sinks. Now, where it gets interesting from an economic point of view is that that amount of money, that value, added value, that service that has been provided to the common good is not reflected in any economic metric. It's not reflected in the GDP. It is as if it never existed. Now, if we look at that it never existed, that's a convenient way of basically saying, I don't owe anything. And so that is already part of the problem of the current metrics, economic metrics that we're using to value companies, stock markets, etc. Let me give an example, one that is kind of hopefully plausible. South Africa produces gold. That's great. And the price of gold, last I checked, was about $1,700 per ounce, US. So what am I talking about? Well, to get gold, the statistical average in South Africa today is to extract 5 grams of gold. You have to move 1 ton of earth. 1 ton of earth, 1,000 kilos, 1,000,000 grams. So you have to move 1,000,000 to extract 5. Let me repeat that. You have to move 1,000,000 units of earth to extract 5 units of precious metal called gold. Now, if I ask any of you to go, here's 1,000,000, here's a 1 ton of earth, go look for 5 grams of gold, you go nuts. That's where chemistry comes in. And so that is done using a chemical process, which includes cyanide, mercury, etc. So effectively what is happening is you are contaminating 1 ton of earth to extract 5 grams of gold, which is great. I'm happy for you. So you have your 5 grams of gold. Now what? You run to the market. You sell it. Great. And you run off and party. That's what's happening. You conveniently forget about that 1 ton of earth that you have contaminated. Question. If we call you back and say, my friend, come back here. You've made some good money. Decontaminate that 1 ton of earth. Put it back the way you found it. It's a bit like your mother telling you, you know, you had a jolly good time as kids, right? We were there cheering everything up. We're having a jolly good time. Till mom arrives and says, hey, tidy up. Put everything where it belongs. This place is a mess. It's happened to all of us, happened to me. And I see myself repeating it or have repeated it to my kids. And they say, oh, geez, now we've got to tidy up. Yeah, you got to tidy up. That's what decent human beings do. You tidy up. Live in a neat environment. But that's not what happens. So my question is, if you've made your money at the price of $1,700 US an ounce, you sold your gold, that's good. Now I call you back and say, okay, decontaminate that 1 ton of earth. My question is, do you still have change left over? Oh, you don't have to, oh, so it's going to cost you more to decontaminate. Well, maybe the price of gold is maybe too low. Maybe the price of gold only makes sense if it maybe is at $2,500 for 1 ounce, because then I have enough to clean up. And that aspect has been conveniently excluded over time. Not just in the gold industry, but in all the extractive industries, petrol, gas, you name it. So we're just leaving it for our children to sort out. It all ends up with the same thing. So moving forward. So what this means is that if we have, so what does this mean in practical terms? Well, here's an interesting graph. In the field of agriculture, we have a metric, which is called the net yield per hectare. So, you know, what should we plant? Should we plant tomatoes? Should we plant marijuana? Should we plant coconut? What gives us the maximum, the biggest bang for the buck? Yield per hectare. And so Purdue University did a study in 2019 where they looked at the net yield of, in 5 countries for the production of soya. So we look at Argentina, USA, Russia, Ukraine, Brazil. It ranges between $9 and $200. That's a huge difference. If you want to know why, read the report. This is just the executive summary. So in the US is what? $28 per hectare net yield for the production of soya. So the question is, okay, how does that compare to a primary tropical forest that sequesters on average about 7 tons of carbon a year, on average? And so you can see that if it's $20 a ton, 20 times 7, you would end up having 140. So if the average price per ton of carbon is higher than $25, then you can technically generate a higher net yield per hectare by just monetizing the carbon sequestration capacity of the forest. On the European market, the price when I did this graph was 51 euros, which is about $62 at the current exchange rates. So that equates to a net yield of $435. That, my dear friends, is where the opportunity is. So what this means is that next year, when I sit together with President Bolsonaro of Brazil, and he wants to know why I want to talk to him, and I tell his PA that we're going to have a conversation about optimizing the net yields within Brazil, they will say, all right. And I see Mr. President, and he says, oh, I hear you want to talk economics. I say, yep, I want to talk economics. I said, so I says, Mr. President, what's your average yield, soya, Brazil? He says, oh, about $200. I said, okay. What if I could increase that by 20%? Now you have my attention. How do you want to do that? By monetizing the carbon sequestration of your forest. You mean of those trees that I've been cutting down? Yeah. How much can I get? Well, European market, that's where it is. Boom, 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 boom. You can actually pretty much double that. So he says, wait. Are you telling me that we've been burning down the bank? And I say, well, that's a pretty good way of looking at it. Yes, I think you have been. Now, some of you may be wondering, where does that price come from? Well, I just did a snapshot today, especially for you, to show you where the price is today. So if I zoom in here a little bit so that you can see. So at the beginning of the year, this is of the European EU emission trading scheme, daily carbon prices. At the beginning of the year, it was at close to what, 32, 33 bucks, euros. The last we have, it's at 59 euros. So it went from close to 30, it actually exceeded 60 euros about 2 weeks ago. And the price is going to continue up based on supply demand. So now we have a situation. The corporates, many corporates around the world, especially in Europe, are committed to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, with, you know, to be in line with the Millennium Goals and the Paris Agreement and blah, 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 blah. So one way is to reduce your carbon emission. That's correct. But no matter how much you reduce, you still have a residual carbon footprint that needs to be offset, sequestered, or whatever. Now, the question is, how does it work? Well, there's so many different types of certificates. There are different metrics, multiple standards. There's no central registry. There's double trading, all sorts of things going on, and you are not able to transact directly with those who have the carbon sinks. Then they say you need to invest in projects and invest in climate projects and this and that. There's no logic for the pricing. And so the whole thing is very confusing for those who are in this area. And like I said, $200+ billion is floating around in the carbon market, of which less than 1.5% goes to the actual communities and regions that are actually absorbing. So it's a confusing situation, to say the least. So what is needed? What we need is clarity on 3 issues. 3 major questions need to be answered, which is how, where, and when a ton of CO2 is actually absorbed. We need to talk about real sequestration. No hyperbole, no what they call emission avoidance, and no, very simple. If I am paying for something, I want to know exactly how, where, and when, okay? And it should be scientifically measured. It should be measured with using scientifically peer-reviewed metrics, not some hyperbole based on a policy, based on whatever, and independently verified. And so that's what we need. Now the question is, can we achieve that? The answer is yes. And the solution basically is, first of all, we need to include existing carbon sinks, which, by the way, are excluded from the accounting according to the Paris Agreement. It's what we call the compliance market. I won't go into details, but that's one of the reasons why the forests are burning, because they have no economic value. So we must include the existing carbon sinks, and their realistic economic value will automatically be defined by supply and demand. Stakeholders need to be given an incentive and the means to protect and enhance the existing carbon sinks. Emitters and governments need to clearly and transparently assess their needs in order to balance emissions with sequestration. And the carbon pricing has to be based on real-time global situation of supply and demand. And once that is done, then we can have a rational conversation about land usage, land optimization, yield per hectare. And all of that begins to gel in moving us to the area of achieving some form of sense that will lead us to, hopefully, the planetary balancing of emissions with sequestration. And if we do this in a smart way, then we are achieving an economic sustainable initiative that can meet ESG and SDG, so that's the environmental, social governance criteria of investors, and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. It has a positive impact on the society, and at the end of the day, it mitigates against climate change. So the solution that we have created is effectively a situation where the CO2 emitters, the corporations, the factories, etc., through a platform can connect and link up with the CO2 converters. How that works, I can explain a little bit later, but effectively, once that capability to connect is provided for, then you can exchange information. And so there's an audit process. These emitters have to be, these converters have to be, audited, verifying ownership of the land, verifying scientifically what the sequestration is, and I will show you some examples after that, to arrive at the actual sequestration, and that sequestration capacity can then be sold to the highest bidder on the emitter side. And they have the advantage of having their carbon footprint realistically, factually, scientifically assessed, sequestered. You need to have auditors, independent auditors, independent assessors. So the ones that we're using for the terrestrial carbon sinks is the Swiss Federal Technical University of Zurich, together with Restore, the Crowther Lab, and also Google. And that's linked into a network, a science network that includes NASA, Max Planck Institute, Jet Propulsion Lab, and various other research establishments around the planet. For the marine carbon assessment, we work with the Bermuda Institute of Ocean Sciences. And there again, they are the scientific node into the science network that also includes, amongst others, NOAA, NASA, etc. And then in different parts, we have independent, auditors that do the physical audits of the various carbon sinks. And so the emitters and the converters are able to transact together. So what we then do, and I won't go too much into this, but every 1 ton of carbon that has been scientifically assessed as sequestered is represented as a token. And we have 3 types of tokens. One is called a green Gaia, which represents 1 metric ton of carbon sequestration that has occurred over a 12-month period. A blue Gaia that has happened in a marine carbon sink. The green Gaia is in a terrestrial carbon sink, and the white Gaia is through an industrial process. Each of these is linked, each of the tokens is linked to an extensive database. And that database is derived from the audit report and the data analysis. And it shows the unique geolocation where that 1 ton of carbon has been sequestered. And it also includes a satellite image showing exactly where that 1 ton of carbon was sequestered with a timestamp from 2. So by default, no two tokens are the same. Each one is unique. Each one has its own crypto code. And when it is redeemed, the key is then sent, which opens that up, and you can literally take out your electronic certificate of verification with not just a certificate, but the entire database. And you can now answer the 3 cardinal questions: how, where, and when that 1 ton of carbon was actually sequestered. And by it being unique, it cannot be replicated or duplicated, and it cannot be transacted more than once. So we have the emitters who transact with the converters. The converters have the Gaias, which is the token, the CO2 token. And we also have a unique payment token called a Koi, which is represented over here. That's the payment token. So the ecosystem, so don't be shocked by this. Everybody just take a deep breath. I don't want people to be clicking off and say, oh my God, I can't deal with this. But this is the way it works. The emitters get onto the system, so to speak. They take the fiat currency, the US dollars or whatever, go through an e-exchange. They get the Koi. The Kois are passed on to the converters of choice. And simultaneously, the Gaias that the emitters have purchased are moved over to the emitter. The emitter now has the transaction report and now has exact information of how, where, and when every 1 ton of carbon sequestration that has been purchased has been accounted for. The converter, on the other hand, has received the Koi. They can take that back through an e-exchange and convert that back into a fiat currency of their choice. And then they can use it according to the way they want to use it. So it's a very simple system. It can be used using a device like a smartphone, a desktop, whatever. It's very intuitive and very simple. And on top of that, all the converters have been assessed and they've been asked what they want to do with the use of funds. And according to the use of funds, they are linked to one of the 17 SDGs. And by being linked to one of the 17 SDGs, that becomes part of the profile of the converter. So what this means is that an emitter, a company like GM or Ford or whoever it is, an airline, Delta or whatever, they have their own corporate social responsibility statement, which in many regards we don't take really seriously because we know that it's a nice statement, but we don't really know, are they meeting it or not? But in this case, the emitter can say, yeah, based on our corporate social responsibility statement, we would like to be linked to SDG 6, 7, and 8. And so they can put that in as a search criteria, and the system generates or identifies the converters that have 6, 7, and 8 as part of the SDGs. So when the transaction is now done, in the transaction report, that is also mentioned, which means that the emitter can pass the transaction report right on to the investors, who can now say, okay, we want to check whether you meet our ESG criteria. And yes, that's how it can be done. So the transaction report links the corporate social responsibility statement of an emitter to the SDGs of the converter, and at the same time can now be used as the reports to document as documentary evidence the fact that the company has met the ESG goals of their investors. And so that's a really cool thing about it. And so at the end of the day, we can answer exactly how, where, and when. The transaction report that the emitters get links the ESGs to the CSRs to the SDGs. The converters get an economic benefit of the carbon sink. And in many ways, you have a win-win. Let me give an example. In Tanzania, for the non-Africans or for those who may not be aware of the history, Tanzania is actually an amalgamation of originally two independent states. You had the state of Tanganyika, and you had Zanzibar. They got together and formed a new nation called Tanzania, or Tanzania, depending on whether you're from West Africa or from East Africa. North of the island of Zanzibar is an island called Pemba. The main island of Zanzibar is the one that has probably 90% of the population of Zanzibar, of the archipelago. And Pemba is largely low population density. It has about 176,000 hectares. It's got largely natural and some managed land usage. We've done the assessment. This is an example of the assessment that we do. In this case, the area measured was 176,000 hectares. This is a snapshot of the satellite image. And based on the satellite data, the algorithms that we use, we've arrived at 876,000 metric tons of carbon that was sequestered in the year 2020. As you can see, the rate of carbon sequestration is not a constant. It changes from year to year due to climatic conditions, etc. And you can see it's been on a decline, which effectively matches the data as to the loss of trees and natural vegetation. Now, if we now take this, and initially we say, okay, we'll take 70% of what is called the net primary productivity, and that's because this is an assessment which needs to be then clarified through the scientific analysis that we do in situ, using soil data, etc. And so this initial estimate, it will then give you 578,000 green Gaias. Based on the average price you can get, if it's $20, then they could effectively generate a revenue of $11.5 million US. That is $11.5 million US just for the year 2020. Next year, if this curve goes up or down, and the price either goes up or down, they will arrive at a new revenue for the year 2021. And so what this means is that Pemba Island will, if they use this funds based on a program that they commit to, these are the SDGs that will be affected. And the SDGs that we're looking at is also for conservation of biodiversity, reforestation, and also providing, giving that revenue back to the people in the form of social programs, in education, rural healthcare, etc. And so this represents a very powerful revenue model. I'm going to show you guys afterwards an example of another one in Tanzania, of the Serengeti, because that's a place that some of you are aware of. If we scale this up and we look at, island nations, the so-called SIDS, small island development states, and we look at Cape Verde, which is off the coast of West Africa, and we look at Bahamas, which is off the coast of Florida, and we look at what is the potential of monetizing natural carbon sequestration. So here we can see that the amount of carbon sequestered on the land compared to the carbon sequestered in the ocean, they're part of their exclusive economic zone. You arrive at the value of Cape Verde is between 136 and 600,000 metric tons of carbon sequestration. Again, it's a curve that fluctuates, so we need to look at the specific year, and likewise with the oceans as well. But when you apply a price of 24.8 or call it $25 a ton, you start looking, you begin to see what the potential is. So for Cape Verde, it's between 3 and 14 million, not that great from a country point of view, but it's between 50 and close to 120 million from the ocean. That's significant. That's the revenue that can be effectively monetized through the marine carbon sinks. When we look at the Bahamas, they are sequestering a little bit more compared to the Cape Verde, between 800,000 and 3.6 million. So they can generate between 20 and 90 million, 89 million terrestrial carbon sinks, and between 40 and 100 million, 97.5 million, through the marine carbon sinks. If you combine these two, that becomes a significant revenue point for the Bahamas. If these funds are utilized in the right way, they can have a tremendous social impact. Let me share an example of how new solutions can be created. We have a program called the Oxi-zen Youth Education System. It's called, OYES. And so it starts with the 5-year-old kid. So just as an example. So we have a program that we use, or the children are involved. So the first week in school, every child plants 3 trees. These trees are registered in the name of the child and becomes a part of the Converse project. As the trees grow, they absorb CO2, and that carbon sequestration can then be monetized through Oxi-zen. And the revenue is then redistributed to the account of each child and is managed by the school system. So it sounds complicated, but in the end, what does it mean? It means that the first tree finances the primary school education of the child. The first and second tree combined finances the secondary school education. The first, second, and third tree combined finances the tertiary stroke vocational training of the child. That program alone is not only financing the education of the next generation, but it also affects the moral value system. So each child becomes the protector of their trees. The parents of the child become the protector of the trees of their child. And so the community begins to protect the trees. The community will look for the alternatives to leave the trees. And all of a sudden, you've shifted the value system. Now, we in Africa are working on establishing the Green Wall of Africa that goes from Senegal all the way to Djibouti, across the Sahel region, as a green wall to combat the expansion of the Sahara Desert. Some of you are aware of the resulting social impact that the increased desertification is happening, with the result that there's insecurity, there's a spread of fundamental, Islam, radicalized Islam, and that is now an area of insecurity because of the reduction of available resources, natural resources, fundamentally speaking. And so this program could go a long way to become part of a solution that is really hampering not just Africa, but the rest of the world as well. And at the same time, it hits a lot of the SDGs. And also, it allows boys and girls, gender equality, to have access to the school education. Because in the past, obviously, and unfortunately, if you have two kids, one is a boy, one is a girl, you don't have enough money, you have to choose which kid. Boys were chosen over girls. So this goes a long way to achieve real gender equality. And so these are the various SDGs that can be achieved through the OES program. So at this point, let me give you guys a very quick practical example. So I'm gonna, I want to share this screen here with you. So for some of you guys who are, let's say, science nerds, you may enjoy this. So this is the Serengeti. So let me show you how some of the satellite assessment works. So what we have here is the African continent. Some of you have heard of the Serengeti. And so we have the ability to go in to quite amazing detail, where we start actually seeing individual trees. And we can see what is happening. This is a stream. This is open savanna. Here we have scattered trees again, etc. And so we can go into tremendous detail. And the other thing that we can also do is we have different satellite layers that we can look at. And so, so we can look at detailed information as to what we are looking for, and so there's great scientific information that we can get. So one of the things that we can see is we can see what the organic carbon content is in the soil. As well, we can also see what the carbon sequestration is. And so we can see it's about 14.4 million metric tons of carbon sequestration that happens within this particular polygon. There's some other neat things that we can do with, we can also give advice on the vegetation, etc. But what we then do is we take that information and we then issue the assessment report. So this is what I wanted to basically show you guys. So this is the Serengeti. This is the carbon sequestration, the area measured. And we can see that we're taking initially 70% of that as the estimation. And based on the price that can be achieved on the open market, this is the amount of money that can be generated. So between 50, 100, 150, over $200 million can be generated on the carbon market by the Serengeti. So what does this mean? Right now, the Serengeti has been able to generate an income based on an economic model that was based on tourism. The Maasai that live in that area are organized under what we call conservancies. So you have different clans and different groups and different families, etc. They get together to combine their interests, and they thereby do not divide their land. So they leave it open so that the entire biodiversity can roam. The elephants can move, the zebras, the wildebeests, etc. They lease out pockets of land to hospitality service providers who are running lodges, safari camps, etc. They pay a lease. They employ the local guys, the local population. So they work in these camps. The game wardens and the game rangers are the local guys. And so that ecosystem worked. So if somebody comes, a tourist comes and says, hey, we want to see elephants. Yeah, I'll show you elephants in my backyard. I'll show you where they are today because it's my backyard. But what happened? We had COVID. The whole ecosystem collapsed. Not just in Tanzania, in many parts of the world. Now the question is, what do we do? How do we continue generating income to pay the rangers, to pay the staff, to pay the managers in the lodges who were getting money and they were paying school fees, medical costs, etc. It's a terrible situation. And the question is, how long can they survive until tourism comes back? When is travel going to be open again? Nobody knows. When are the airlines going to be back at full speed? Nobody knows. When are the countries going to open up again for tourists? Nobody knows. So this is a real challenge. In this situation now, we have an alternative ecosystem, an alternative economic model. Rather than depend on tourism, we monetize carbon sequestration. And that's exactly what we're doing now with Oxi-zen. And so in the case of the Serengeti, these are the numbers that can be generated, which can just then end up being the difference between somebody in total desperation shooting a rhino to be able to monetize the resources of his environment so that he or she can pay school fees or pay the medical costs, the doctor's bill for their child. Because if you do not have a plan B, you will execute plan A, no matter how bad it may seem. That's the challenge. Let me repeat that again. If you do not have a plan B, you will execute plan A. And so it is important, before we chastise and criticize people who are acting in a certain way due to desperation, always ask yourself, did they have a plan B? That's exactly what we are now trying to do. Provide a plan B that's actually in many ways probably superior and probably better than plan A. So I will close at this point, and I'll be open to, first of all, I would like to invite you guys to actively join the energy, the movements, the solution, the drive for new solutions, because we cannot continue business as usual. That's very clear. We need new solutions. And those of you guys who are in universities right now, okay, I'm going to make myself very popular now, and also very unpopular. What I'm trying to say here is that the solution for the future comes from the students, not from the professors. So that should give you the motivation and the courage to think out of the box, to be brave to ask uncomfortable questions, and not to be discouraged if somebody says it cannot be done. Trust me, it can be done. And I'll stop at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. This was amazing. So we're almost out of time, but I think we'll have some time to answer some questions, but I'll give the floor to Philip first for comments or questions. You muted, yeah. You're muted, Philip. We're not hearing you.
Oh, sorry. I thought I muted myself. Oh, thank you very much. I mean, it's phenomenal. I already have some comments there, so I don't want to repeat myself. I put some things in the chat, but there's a question here that I had. And first, again, this is phenomenal. I just like the portrayal, the different portrayal of Africa that I get out of this, of people that are globally significant and creative and impacting the world, not people that are dependent and in need, and behind, So this is a message that resonates very well with me, and I think it resonates with everybody. I'm hoping. But what I've said here is, could you say more about how this effort is being, this effort to achieve planetary CO2 balance is being powered and driven by Africans? You had already talked about the implications for the African continent, so you need not say anything about that. But I'd like to know how it is being driven by Africans and powered by Africans, and whether you're receiving any kind of support from African governments or educational institutions.
It's a very interesting question, Philip. We are getting a lot of, let me put it this way, we have a very good uptake in Kenya and in Tanzania. And we're also getting very good feedback and very good uptake in certain Asian countries, as well as in Latin American countries. But surprisingly, our African governments, our civil servants, have a challenge to think out of the box. So what happens is that there's a certain modus operandi that they have, and to think of something different or to do something different is a challenge. And it's very, very unfortunate. And that's one of the things that we are battling with. The other thing is that the governments are also kind of, how can I say, they are tying themselves to the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement, as I mentioned, excludes existing carbon sinks. And so they say, oh, because the Paris Agreement says this or that, we are not allowed to do that. I say, no. That's why there are two markets. There's the so-called compliance market, and there's the voluntary market. And the voluntary market is the market that is increasing, is becoming more significant, because people realize that is what needs to be done. And so what I lament is the lack of bravery, the lack of courage by our so-called leaders to actually break out of the mold. There are very few forward-looking leaders, unfortunately, on the African continent today. You can name them on less than one hand. We all know what we're talking about. So that is a challenge. But you know what? It's a challenge. It doesn't mean that we use that as a final obstacle. No, we overcome that, and we're working on that.
There's some questions that Christopher might be able to get to in the Q&A. I think the first one kind of has been more or less answered by Christopher, but the very last one there, that there are ecological benefits, but what are the health and climatic costs for those countries who are bearing this burden?
It's huge. It's huge. I mean, the cost, the economic cost is huge. You know, if we look at the low-lying countries as an example, one example is the island of St. Kitts in the Caribbean. I was in St. Kitts, I think it was in 2017. And in the course of my interactions there, I was informed that they've lost close to 30% of their island due to rising sea levels already. That in itself says it all. We're looking at some of the South Pacific islands, where every time there is a high tide, their fields are flooded, salt water, ruins the crops, and their homes are flooded. So they have to move certain populations. You are totally exposed to the winds, to storms, storm surges. So it is really, really dire. You have a situation about biodiversity. I just mentioned about whether you have a plan A and a plan B. So if you are desperate and you don't have a plan B, and somebody, you know, offers you, I don't know what, X amount for the tusk of an elephant, you will say no, to the point where you hear your child crying because there's no food, the other child is sick, and at some point you say, you know what, a man has to do what a man's got to do. You shoot that elephant, take the ivory, sell it, so that you can put food on the table. That's the pressure on the ecosystem. That's the pressure on the biodiversity. And so you look at Kruger National Park, South Africa. I'll give that as an example. Kruger National Park in South Africa is a conflict region. The population at the perimeter of the park are kept outside the park, which is 19,000 square kilometers. So they are kept away. They're not allowed to go into the park. They cannot benefit from the resources of the park, whatever those resources are. At the same time, the government has to provide the management, the protection of the biodiversity, because that's the main attraction for the tourist industry. So for the government, it's a cost center. It's a headache. It's a hassle. And now tourism has collapsed. So now the question is, okay, how do we fund this? Now you're fighting and struggling for the resources just to manage that park. At the same time, the population at the perimeter needs to also feel inclusive within corporate South Africa. And so we now come in with the value proposition saying, hey, monetize the carbon sequestration of the park through Oxi-zen. And when you do the analysis, they can generate about $200 million in a year. So $200 million far exceeds the management budgets of the park, one. And two, they can use those funds to improve the service delivery, number one. They can include they can incorporate newer technology for monitoring, wildlife and endangered species using drones, etc., remote sensing, analytical capabilities, etc. But most importantly, the majority of the funds should be used for the benefits of the population at the perimeter of the park. Provision of rural healthcare, pipe-borne water, electrification, education, basic infrastructure. So once the population receives the benefits and they understand, oh, this is the benefit we are receiving through the carbon sequestration of the park, guess what? The population becomes your partner. They will partner with you to protect that because they want that increased. So is there any way we can increase the carbon sequestration? Yes, we need to restore areas that have been exposed to erosion. We need to replant trees that were cut down before. We have to preserve biodiversity. And then there can be alternative benefits that then can now be used for the benefit of the population. And that's when you have a win-win. So it's not a zero-sum game. There is something called 1 + 1 is actually greater than 2. This is the thing. This is the first thing you are taught in school is wrong. 1 + 1 = 2. No. 1 + 1 can be greater than 2. How is that possible? Well, you take a seed and you take another seed and you bury it. By the time you blink twice and you come back, you find out that you have a tree with multiple seeds. That's where 1 + 1 is greater than 2. And so these are the things that we need to communicate to get out, and we have to think out of the box. We cannot basically restrain ourselves with the mental shackles. Like Bob Marley said in the song Redemption, emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Bottom line.
Wonderful. So I think this is more like a comment. How might you be able to promote your ideas to build a movement? I'm thinking that the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent might provide a suitable platform to catalyze the innovative ideas you have presented. Thank you so much.
Appreciate that.
Go ahead.
Sorry, was that a question or was that a comment?
It was more like a comment. So they want to promote. I guess they're giving you the idea of a place where you're.
Yes, as a matter of fact, at the end of the day, I think it's all hands together. Basically all hands on deck. And I am open to collaborate and to speak and to give encouragement. At the same time, we are open to receive innovative ideas, forms of a cooperation. We're very happy to do that. And so I can be easily contacted either via LinkedIn or via the website, Oxi-zen.io. So from that point of view, we're definitely open.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you so very much. This was a great presentation. We learned a lot, and thank you for coming and sharing. And thank you, Philip, also for introducing our guests and for your comments. And thank you everybody for coming. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris.
You're welcome.